Hello again, students. We're going to continue our look at the challenges and problems facing the United States in the late 19th century as sort of a parallel to the changes that we examined in Topic 1. Lesson 2 will focus us once again on the West, primarily the Great Plains region, and rather than looking at it from the perspective of the changes brought about from the wave of mostly white settlement in the region, we're going to look at this from the perspective of the Native Americans who already lived there. One of the first things we want to consider or keep in mind is that primarily the conflict between the Native Americans and whites was over the use of land in the West. All of those settlers we saw moving into the region for farming and mining and other economic activities are coming into conflict with the Native American groups living on the Great Plains who used it primarily as a hunting ground. After the Civil War, the United States government is going to be able to focus the military more directly on the conflict with Native Americans in the West and send its soldiers out in that direction, like the Buffalo Soldiers seen here in this picture. A Buffalo Soldiers was a nickname given to them by perhaps the Apache, although accounts vary, because of the dark curly hair that these men had that they thought sort of resembled the hide of the buffalo. Now, in this time period, the mid-19th century, the United States had started to shift its Indian policy towards one of reservation system and forcing the American Indians onto plots of land after conflicts and treaties are signed. And in return, the government will agree to supply them with what they need to survive: food, medicine, and so forth. The reality of this was, though, that in the late 19th century in particular, there was a great deal of corruption throughout all levels of government. And the government agents put in charge of distributing this aid often stole from those funds, or they lacked the power and authority to enforce the treaties and to keep whites off of the land that had been set aside for the Native Americans. Due to the inability or unwillingness of the United States government to abide by or enforce the terms of the treaties, there will be a series of conflicts on the Great Plains in the late 19th century referred to as the Indian Wars. The typical pattern of these conflicts will go something like this. The United States government makes a treaty with the Native Americans, setting up boundaries of their land in which they can continue to hunt and operate. White settlers will decide that they want that land for various reasons, move on to that land in violation of the treaty, leading to the American Indians attacking them, and then the white settlers will call upon the United States cavalry for assistance, leading to further conflict and another treaty, and so on and so forth. One of the earliest of these conflicts, though, occurs before the end of the Civil War, 1863. Famed American frontiersman Kit Carson is sent out to the Southwest with a detachment of troops to try and subdue the Navajo people in that region. He and the American troops will destroy the homes and crops of the Navajo and force march them 300 miles to a small reservation that they must share with the Apache, who were their enemies. After 4 long years of death and disease and starvation, the Navajo were finally allowed to move back to a reservation closer to their homeland. Now, the event that's oftentimes cited as the beginning of the Great Plains conflict is the one depicted in this painting here, and that's the Sand Creek Massacre in 1864. A Colorado militia came across an encampment of Arapaho and Cheyenne Indians near Fort Lyons. They immediately attacked the camp, not realizing or not caring to realize that the American Indians had made an agreement with the commander of the fort to camp there for a period of time. In all, they killed 150 to 200 Arapaho and Cheyenne men, women, and children, and sparked a new series of conflicts. A key treaty in this time period is the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie, and this ended a conflict between the Lakota Sioux of the northern Great Plains with the federal government over the government's desire to build a road through their hunting grounds to connect to gold mining areas in Montana. The Sioux agreed to live on a reservation that had as its center the Black Hills in South Dakota, which was a sacred area to them. The United States government agreed not to build a road on that, and that this land, including the Black Hills, and that is key, would remain in their hands, in the hands of the Sioux, in perpetuity, meaning essentially that would be their land forever. 6 years later, another conflict will erupt near West Texas with the Red River Massacre of 1874. The United States government had broken its treaty with the Kiowa and Comanche and other Native American groups in that region by not keeping white buffalo hunters off of their territory and not delivering on the food and supplies that they had agreed to in the treaty. Preventing buffalo hunters from coming onto their land was very much key, as the buffalo was a staple part of the food, shelter, clothing, culture, and so much more to the Great Plains peoples. And oftentimes, white buffalo hunters would shoot them just for their hides and leave everything else, or just for sport. And sometimes there was actually an effort to encourage people to kill the buffalo because the Indians relied upon it for so much. In response to the government not enforcing the treaty, the Kiowas and Comanche will attack a group of Texans near the Red River, sparking a response from the federal government, which eventually leads to the defeat of most of the southern Great Plains tribes. A significant victory for the Native Americans occurs in 1876 at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Now, this is back up on that reservation that had been set aside for the Sioux that included the Black Hills. Prospectors had discovered gold in that region, and white settlers were beginning to move into that area. So the U.S. government sent the army into the Dakotas region, and a detachment of men under the command of Colonel George Armstrong Custer arrived earlier than the rest and were kind of surveying the area for potential white settlement and potential problems with the Native Americans. Custer comes across a group of 2,000 Sioux under the command of Sitting Bull, pictured here on the left, and Crazy Horse. Custer had about 250 U.S. troops. He attacked the superior force and was wiped out to a man. In response to this, the federal government will send the army after Sitting Bull. He is chased all the way to Canada, captured, and forced onto a reservation. The gentleman on the right is Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce Indians. The Nez Perce kind of tried a different tactic, which was to adopt a lot of the white ways. Many of them had converted to Christianity, and they were renowned horse and cattle traders. So they had adopted a lot of economic and cultural ideas from white America. This in no way prevented them from being treated the same as other Native Americans with this. They were being forced to move to a smaller reservation to make way for more white settlers, and Chief Joseph, in defiance of this, led a group of Nez Perce away from that location towards Canada. They will be captured by the army, and there's a very famous speech from American history where Chief Joseph explains why he is surrendering. He will not, however, give up on his fight in the legal sense. He will go to Washington, D.C. 3 times to appeal to the United States government for a return to their homeland. He is rejected every time, and eventually his people are forced onto a tiny reservation in Oklahoma. The last of the conflicts in the Great Plains occurs in 1890 with the Wounded Knee Massacre. I oftentimes hesitate to show some of the more gruesome pictures. This is a photo after Wounded Knee, when the American Indians' bodies were just sort of left out in the snow. But I also think it's kind of important that we bear witness to events like this. There was a revival movement of American Indian religion and culture referred to as the ghost dance. And the practitioners of the ghost dance believed that if they followed the rituals of this, returned to some of their old ways, that the Great Spirit would wipe the white settlers away, push them back, and bring back the buffalo. This starts to make the United States government nervous. They send in the army. They go to arrest Sitting Bull on the reservation, and he ends up being killed by the soldiers attempting to arrest him. A group of Sioux then left the reservation and headed into the Badlands. They were pursued by the United States Army. The Army partially disarmed them before shots rang out. Not really sure which side started it, but I have a pretty good guess. And again, they massacred all of the American Indians there. Well, not all of them, but 100 men, women, and children killed there. And this is seen usually as the final event in this conflict over the Great Plains. The U.S. government will shift its policy toward the Native Americans then in the 1880s and 1890s towards one of assimilation, trying to bring the Native Americans into what they considered to be mainstream American culture and eliminating their own culture. They no longer recognize tribes as independent powers within the U.S. and do not recognize the authority of those leaders. The Dawes Severalty Act, or the Dawes Allotment Act, will change how land is dealt with on the reservations. Instead of being owned in common by the tribes as had been traditional, the government divided up the land into 160-acre plots to be individually farmed by Native American families. Now, if you recall, that 160-acre number should be familiar. That was the size of land allotted by the Homestead Act. And it's in the same region, and it has the same problem with the Homestead Act in that it is based off of the size of an eastern farm where there's a great deal more rainfall. And in these western regions, there is less rainfall, and 160 acres is not sufficient farm size. As you can see by these maps, the amount of land allotted to the Native Americans will diminish significantly. One of the other things that the government will do and private individuals will set up boarding schools for Native American children in the East and pressure their parents to send them to these boarding schools. And this is kind of part and parcel with the Americanization movement that tried to enculturate immigrants coming to the United States through the settlement houses. Now, at these boarding schools, the American Indian children were forced to cut their hair, change their clothes, as you can see by this young man in the before and after picture here, speak English, convert to Christianity, and essentially live the white lifestyle. The slogan of the Carlisle School, one of the best known of these boarding schools, was "Kill the Indian to save the man." The idea was that if you eliminate the Native American culture, the man who results from that will be able to get along in American society and to survive. So from the perspective of some of these people, they were helping the Native Americans, but it's definitely a paternalistic view of them in that their culture is the right one and they know what's best for them. Today, historians debate whether to call what the United States government did to the American Indians a genocide, but tens of thousands of them were killed from conflict, disease, and starvation due to their mistreatment, and their culture was deliberately attempted to be stamped out by the government. The Lesson 2 graphic organizer is a table. In the second column, you'll see a date. In the first column, you need to pick one of the events from the key at the bottom of the paper that matches up with that date. The third column, you tell me what happened in that event. In the fourth column, you tell me why that is important. I filled in the first one here for you. The first date is the Navajo Long Walk, and I tell you what happened and why it's important. Southwest Indians forced onto reservations. All of the information to fill this in should be available to you in the Topic 2 outline. All right, good luck. Te amo. Adios.